All right, so thank you all so much for being here today. I still see some folks trickling in, which is great. This is a community call, a monthly community call, but it is co-hosted by the ORCID Canada community led by CRKN and the ORCID US community led by Lyrasis. Today's topic is going to be about ORCID and researcher profiles, and we've got a wonderful guest speaker who I'll be introducing in just a few minutes. But I do want to start with some housekeeping. So the first thing is that there is an agenda document that you should have received in the Zoom invite, and otherwise that we'll make sure to post in the chat so that you can access it now. And on that document, you'll also be able to see the slides right away, both the introduction slides that I'll be presenting with Sheila and Paolo, and our guest Mike Nason's slides. For now, your microphone is muted. You'll be able to unmute only at the end of the presentation once we get to the Q&A and discussion section, but please do feel free to use the chat box for questions, comments, discussion, whatever you want. As mentioned, the slides are linked to in the agenda document, so they're all immediately available for you to take a look at, but we are recording the presentation, so you'll be able to access it online at some point, usually within about a week after our webinar here. Then the last thing is that closed captions are available to you if you would like to turn that setting on using Zoom's auto transcription, excuse me, in your Zoom window. If you're trying to do that and you can't do it, please send me a private message when I'm done speaking here, and I'm happy to provide some insight. Okay, last piece of housekeeping. In terms of community call norms, we're going to be using Lyrasis's code of conduct for this presentation. So in this virtual space, we strive to engage in respectful discussion, ask questions and seek clarification, be receptive to feedback from others. I do want to add one quick thing about the agenda that I forgot, which is please, if you log into the agenda, if you open the agenda document, you'll see that there's a space that says attendees. Please go in there, create a new bullet point, add your name, affiliation, and that would be wonderful. So just to introduce us, you probably know the three of us on this slide. Sheila Rabin, the ORCID of the ORCID US community / Lyrasis, is the program leader for persistent identifier communities. Paolo Guhilde is the ORCID US community specialist, also at Lyrasis with the ORCID US community. And then I'm the manager of the Canadian persistent identifier community, gestionnaire communauté canadienne des identifiants pérennes. I'm John Aspler, and I work at the Canadian Research Knowledge Network. So of course, you probably all know us. If you don't, please feel free to reach out to us. We're here to support you in our respective jurisdictions. And then we have a wonderful guest speaker today. This is Mike Nason. He is the Scholarly Communications and Publishing Librarian at the University of New Brunswick. But Mike also has a lot of specific experience with ORCID as the chair of the ORCID Canada Governing Committee. So we're in good hands for his portion of the presentation. So just to give you a quick overview of what it is that we'll be doing today. So Sheila is going to start with an overview of the current researcher profile landscape, just to take a moment to try and disambiguate some of the different terms that might be thrown around. So for example, ORCID IDs are persistent identifiers, but there are other persistent identifiers for people, like Scopus's author ID. So we're going to talk a little bit about ORCID and in comparison to those, as well as in comparison to researcher profiles more broadly, things like academia.edu. And then finally, some of the ways that in particular, these other identifiers and not so much the profiles are meaningfully connected in ORCID's user interface through these tools called search and link wizards, which help you add works, publications, data sets, whatever, to your ORCID record. Sheila, can you still hear me?
Oh, I can hear you now. Sorry.
But I can't hear you.
Oh, you can't hear me. Can everyone else hear me?
I can hear you, Sheila.
Okay. John, I think it's just you at this point. We can hear you. While we're waiting for John, are you back?
I am back. Really sorry about that. My computer dock sometimes just disconnects me from everything.
No worries. Somebody did ask in the chat, are slides being shared? And if you go to the agenda document that Paolo just linked in the chat, you'll see that we have links to the slides as well in that agenda document. And as John mentioned earlier, you can add your name to the list of attendees as well.
I really, excuse me, didn't have too much more to add. I was just going to say that once Sheila is done that section, Mike is going to give us a sort of more fulsome 30-minute presentation on the topic of ORCID and researcher identifiers and other researcher profiles. And then at the end, we'll have time for Q&A and discussion. But again, please do feel free to throw questions and discussion points into the chat throughout the presentation. So with that, I'll pass it over to Sheila.
Great, thanks, John. So yeah, just to get us started, since our main focus is ORCID, but we're looking at other researcher identifiers and other profiles in relation to ORCID, first we wanted to point out that within an individual's ORCID record, there is an other IDs section that you're seeing highlighted here on the left side. So this is John's ORCID record, and you can see that in his other IDs, he has his Scopus author ID and also his researcher ID, both linked here in his ORCID record. And individuals cannot go and type this information in themselves. They basically have to connect their ORCID ID with Scopus and with Web of Science for Researcher ID in order to get these identifiers linked. So if we go to the next slide, and John, I'm not sure what's going on, but there are some kind of like gray boxes on the side. Maybe I'll just share my my screen.
Sorry, I just reshared. Is that fixed, or do you want to share it on your side?
Let's see. There we go. Yeah, that's better.
Okay.
So basically, and this infographic is also linked in the agenda document. And basically, what we've done here is we're comparing ORCID ID with the two other person identifiers. So that is the author ID with Scopus and the researcher ID with Web of Science. And basically, ORCID is open and community driven, platform independent. So you can, the idea behind ORCID is that it's interoperable. You can use it in multiple different platforms. And it does provide a unique persistent identifier for individuals and helps with name disambiguation. Now, both the researcher ID and the author ID from Web of Science and Scopus, those two are person identifiers. They do provide unique persistent identifiers for people, and they do help with name disambiguation. The thing about these two is that they are both proprietary, meaning that they are not open. They are owned by companies, for-profit companies, vendors. And so they're each platform dependent. So author ID, really you can only use that within Scopus, which is owned by Elsevier. And researcher ID really is only applicable in Web of Science and Publons, which are both owned by Digital Science, if that's correct. Or is it Clarivate? I can't remember actually.
I think it's Clarivate, yeah.
Clarivate, I get them confused, sorry about that. But basically the thing to remember is that Web of Science and Scopus are proprietary, they're platform dependent, whereas ORCID is open and can be used across platforms. So this infographic is kind of designed to help people see at a glance what the difference is. And the cool thing though about all three of these is that author ID and researcher ID can be linked to your ORCID ID, like we saw on John's ORCID record in that other ID section. So if we go to the next slide, we'll just quickly show you for Scopus, individuals can go into their ORCID record. So when they're logged in, they can go to the works section of their ORCID record. And when they go to add works, there's an option to click search and link. And so Scopus is one of the search and link wizards in ORCID. So if you click on that search and link and then click on Scopus, you can basically link your Scopus ID to your ORCID record, as well as claim any works that are in Scopus. So that's how you connect your Scopus author ID to ORCID. And then on the next slide, researcher ID, there used to be a search and link wizard for researcher ID and Web of Science. That kind of went away. So it's no longer a search and link wizard, but there's now a portal called Publons that is basically the kind of like a researcher dashboard for Web of Science. And so individuals can go and log into their Publons account. And you can see on the left side that ORCID is a login option for Publons. So if you go to log into Publons, you can use your ORCID ID to log in. And if you do that, then your ORCID ID will basically already be connected. And then once you're logged in, it'll say claim your researcher ID. And so that's basically how you connect your researcher ID with your ORCID record. And you can also sync with ORCID. So any publications that are in Web of Science, you can have them pulled over from ORCID. So for this, you actually have to go through the Publons portal rather than going through your ORCID record. Okay, so on the next slide. So basically that was just an overview of these identifiers. There are several other researcher profile platforms like the ones listed here, academia.edu, ResearchGate, Google Scholar. Unfortunately, none of these are currently connected with the ORCID API. So researchers can't go and like connect their ORCID ID with one of these platforms and have works transferred between the two. But they are, widely used. I know Google Scholar is one of the really popular ones. And so in our agenda doc, there's some links up at the top with, some relevant documentation and stuff about all of this. But I do not consider myself to be an expert in any of these platforms, which is why we have invited Mike to speak to us about all of these different profiles and what the differences are, and basically how he talks to researchers about the differences between these platforms. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Mike.
Hey, I'm just going to share my screen real quick. As I was Googling when Clarivate bought Publons off the top. Right, is my screen suitably shared?
Kind of, we see, well, yes, we see your present view on the side. The slide is at an angle.
Yeah, that's okay. That's all very intentional. I'm just gonna
Perfect,
move,
great.
I have to move all of your faces to a different place. I went with one screen because I know sometimes in Zoom when you do two screens like John does, things go terribly wrong. So I am trying to mitigate today. Mitigating. That's not something I'm great at. So we're going to talk about what I talk about when we talk about researcher profiles and platforms. Spoiler alert, it is not magical realism. If you were a Haruki Murakami fan, you would catch the reference. If you're not, that's fine. So we're going to talk about a variety of research profiles, and the way that I typically talk about this with researchers in general to provide context or other cues for folks to understand this universe. So my name is Mike Nason. I'm the Open Scholarship and Publishing Librarian at UMB Libraries. I am also the Crossref and Metadata Liaison for the Public Knowledge Project, and I'm the chair of the ORCID CA Governing Committee at the moment. I kind of end up in a lot of intersections of metadata and persistent identifiers and publishing. I do love when people call me an expert. I'm not sure I agree, but it's nice regardless. So let's get to it. Assuming my slides will advance. They are not advancing. Pardon me. I do love when this happens. Nothing like a technical off the top. That's very annoying. Apologies. I think the abundant Zoom interface is causing an issue. Ah, great. So a disclaimer off the top, this is Inside Baseball. I think it's important to acknowledge that we're here not just to discuss how these platforms are different, but what we want to do today is talk about how we talk about the scholar profile landscape with researchers at our institutions. My experience is likely different from yours. You may work in a place with either useful or obstructive mandates. You may have a research office whose influence or reach has limited your options, or incredibly, you may work at a place where your research office has expanded your options. I feel like that's much less likely. I can't speak for everyone, but I'm here to share the frameworks that I find useful or important when I'm discussing these topics. Number one is managing expectations. The first and foremost thing that's important with this work is managing your personal expectations. And I've often described my work in scholarly communications is that like every day I go to work, I stand at the edge of a dock and I throw rocks at a cruise ship in order to make the ship change course. And any day I hit the boat is a good day. This is sort of a holdover from conversations about open access, but it kind of works in the advocacy space either way. I spend a lot of time just hoping I can get anybody to listen in general, but it's also about managing your expectations of others. And I say this because professionally, we tend to get exasperated when folks we're working with or for don't embrace the things we think that they should embrace, the things we think are truly important. It doesn't matter how right you are about something if the people you're talking to don't want or have to care. I think the COVID pandemic is a very clear indication of this. Think about how likely you are personally to adopt, say, a new piece of software in your workflow when someone says, hey, this is really great, you should try it. And you're like, I'm good. I'm pretty happy with the things that I've got. So what makes you listen? What appeals to you? How do you get interested in a thing? It's very rarely just someone saying you should. It usually is a little bit more onerous than that. I'd also like to say off the jump that researchers are under an enormous amount of pressure. And researchers are very tired and busy people. So depending on the length of a researcher's career, if you show up and say, this one thing is going to make your life easier, they have absolutely heard that before. They have been led down the garden path a number of times by folks who said that they would make their life easier with something. And it's more likely that it's going to be perceived as one more thing, not this one thing, but one more thing they'll have to care about. So I mean, they've got pressure to publish, they've got increasing course loads, and men are prioritizing metrics in situations that may not always be appropriate, job precarity, a complete lack of jobs that are on the postdoc grind doing sessional instruction, dwindling faculty positions, grant applications, varying grant application requirements. Capitalism is labeled their field irrelevant to the job market, ask an historian. Neoliberal administration cares about the opinions of capitalism. Boy, do they. People soliciting them constantly. This is always the case. Every publisher and every fake, not real, predatory publisher. The discourse, which has us all exhausted, and other things, of course. So there's a lot on the plates of researchers when I walk into a room and say, well, here's what's important today. Some researchers are also rightly, I think, worried about being boiled down into a simple reductive number and compared to one another. This isn't always the case. Some fields are more competitive in this space, and people really do want to hustle and grind and push those metrics. And then there are other disciplines where people really don't want to be involved in this at all, and they actively hate it. And part of the issue is that you don't necessarily know what you're going to get. So I asked this question, like, have you ever had a researcher tell you that they put publisher PDFs of stuff they don't own on ResearchGate? And they're like, it's fine, I own it. And you know that they don't own it, and that's a problem. And then the same person says to you, I don't trust any system that the institution wants me to use. And like that feels inconsistent. They're already abusing a system that isn't intended for something in a way that could get them in real trouble, but they also don't trust a system that you're telling them is useful to them. So, I mean, we understand that ORCID in particular leaves controls to scholars, but it's sometimes less obvious to the people we're talking to, when our institutions are pursuing ORCID integrations and they're hearing from their research office how important ORCID is, they may not always trust it. So being skeptical of your employer is good, actually. If you run into these people, they may seem sometimes a little angry, but it's healthy to not just do whatever your employer says you have to do. If folks are taking time to hear you out about scholar profiles at all, that is a kind of victory. I think that's a good thing to acknowledge off the top. Anything sort of finding out that they've been sharing all their work in a private password protected website that they somehow think is the same as open access is a win. The interaction is nice, and it's sweet validation for you personally. And please remember too, again, at the top of this, that adopting or migrating to a new platform will require labor, and not just any labor, but like the fiddly sort of nonsense that we hate about adjusting metadata metadata in a variety of fields and adjusting publishing metadata that doesn't always match the metadata standards we want on our end, pulling in metadata that's in all caps, for example, or places where the first name wasn't properly captured. There's a lot of fiddly, obnoxious stuff that's involved in this work. So, adopting a new platform or migrating to a new platform is a non-trivial amount of labor. And sure, some faculty will just throw a graduate student at it, but a lot of people won't have access to a human being to point at a problem. And you would say, like, surely once everything's in a platform, they can just push it all out from there. And we know that potential exists, but we're still kind of talking about potential here. We're asking researchers to buy into this potential. It's an investment of their time, and it may very well pay off for them later, but it's still going to sound like an investment to them before we get started. You only need to hit the boat. That's all that matters. You just throw the rock, hit the boat. If you hit the boat, it's a good day. And if you haven't been paying attention, and I'm just talking about hitting boats, rest assured I have nothing against boats. I am from the Maritimes. So platforms, let's talk about where researchers are putting things. And you'll note on this list, I put some things that are well beyond what we typically refer to as a profile, and I'll explain why. So these are the usual suspects: ORCID, Scopus ID, Researcher ID, Google Scholar, Academia.edu, ResearchGate. I put LinkedIn here. It is important to some folks in some fields. And I put personal web pages, which is my favorite when somebody sends me their personal web page full of publications and completely unusable metadata. Very common still, I think, with the specific generation of autodidactic go-getters. When I talk to students and faculty about research profiles, it's usually in the context of sharing their research. Profiles are a part of this, but I don't really think the phrase research profile or researcher profile is used by researchers the way that we use it in libraries or as service providers. And I'd like to distinguish between these by sort of talking about the purpose and the benefits and the drawbacks, the context and the ownership of the people who use those platforms. But I think it's also important to note the other places that people put research and the other places that people share their work. And when I'm always talking to people about sharing their work, I include all of this together, the profiles and all these other pieces as part of one big group. They may not all have APIs for handily trading metadata to other platforms, but you'd be surprised as to how few researchers actively care about whether or not metadata is being pushed in a place that's useful. So, those places include preprint servers, repositories, CRIS systems, Discord, Slack, Twitter, Facebook, all places where the products of research end up that are sort of non-traditional or feel more personal to researchers. Typically, I frame the platforms this way: social media, communities of practice, and research profiles. And I do this to sort of tease out why people are using them in the first place and to help contextualize their use broadly. So we'll start with social media, everybody's favorite nightmare. What we typically think of when we think of social media: Facebook, Twitter, Mastodon, although very few people think of Mastodon. But usually when I'm talking to researchers, they're often surprised to discover that I have lumped in LinkedIn, ResearchGate, and Academia.edu into social media. That's because these companies operate roughly the same way. They form connections between communities and scholars. They allow messaging and exchange. They have profile pages with a, a nice image and some bio statements. They're about sort of selling you as a researcher. And then each of these platforms, predominantly the way that they make money is they sell the data on how you use the platform to other people. They are for-profit platforms, and I think to a T, startups on top of that. So they sell data on the usage and interactions, just like Twitter and Facebook do. That's their monetization goal, is either those things or ads. So these companies are venture capital backed. And their motivation is about making that money back. Venture capital, people like Peter Thiel don't just give you a bunch of money with the expectations you can have it and do nice things. They do it so they can make a profit back on that money. And so with social media, I always try to stress to students, I think students know this, researchers don't always really think about it the same way, but with social media, you are the product. That's the thing that they're selling. That's the thing that's worth something about these platforms to these folks. That doesn't mean that these are bad spaces to share your work, but if Facebook is suspicious, then these aren't much different. So if you know somebody who's totally anti-social media and they think it's all a nightmare, but they have a vibrant ResearchGate profile, it's worth a conversation with them that maybe there's more here than they know. So again, venture capital funded, for-profit, they sell data or ads or partnerships, actually very common with ResearchGate. They've been announcing a number of partnerships with publishers over the last year, and probably we can expect that to continue. ResearchGate is worth almost 88 million in funding. Their lead investor is Goldman Sachs. Academia.edu, their lead investor is Tencent. I don't know if you know Tencent, but they're an enormous Chinese company that make everything from games to movies to investments in any number of startups. Their money is essentially everywhere. So they're a big player. And again, 39 million for Academia.edu. The objective of these platforms is to make money, full stop. And also, they're not yours. They're ephemeral. So much in the way that if Facebook disappeared tomorrow, God willing, all of those images and all of that information would just be gone. They're under no obligation. The end user license agreement you sign when you sign up says that all of that stuff is theirs to take down whenever they want, and they can do more or less whatever they want with it. These things are ephemeral. Again, it doesn't mean they're not useful to you in the moment, but they're not a great place to store a bunch of your work. I would also add to, and I think this escapes the grasp of a lot of people, academia.edu has a .edu designation. In the US, that was legislated as of 2001, that .edu is only for educational institutions, but academia.edu bought the URL before this legislation in 1999. And this sort of domain squatting and trading of expensive domains used to happen a lot, and a lot of people made a ton of money before the first big .com boom. This was part of it. So academia.edu was grandfathered in to this legislation. They are not an academic institution. And this comes up sometimes, and I think a lot of scholars don't understand the distinction, but they're not an academic institution, nor are they reputable in the way you would expect one to be. So social media, I mean, it's easy to proselytize about the dangers of social media and make, as it is to make excuses for using it. I use Twitter. I recently left Facebook and feel really good about it. I try not to be too judgmental because there's no ethical consumption, yada, yada, yada. We're all in a doomed hellscape, I guess. But the benefits here is that they're specifically made to facilitate connections, and they're as ubiquitous as they are easy to use. If people think Facebook is bad, they probably shouldn't lean into these, but there are lots of compelling reasons for scholars to use them. And again, money is the whole point. The next thing I usually talk about with folks is communities of practice. And this is going to be pretty straightforward. We're kind of in one right now. ORCID CA has a bunch of users on a Slack channel that we talk about, varying issues. And there's listservs that we get and other communities of practice that we're part of. So again, Facebook, Twitter, Mastodon, social media also is a community of practice. People use Twitter professionally. They have, researcher groups on Facebook. They share their work in those places. But LinkedIn, ResearchGate, and Academia.edu are also communities of practice. Because of the connective tissue that exists, you can kind of be part of those communities while you're working in these platforms. Maybe LinkedIn less so, but ResearchGate and Academia.edu very much so. So we shouldn't be too surprised when these platforms appear to be pulling double duty between the idea of a place I put my work and represent my work and a way to communicate with the other people in my field. That's a big plus. And then obviously there are other communities of practice like Slack and Discord. Normally when I talk to researchers, I talk about, these things as being kind of important, I think, to sharing your work more broadly. And then I include bioRxiv and arXiv, not just as communities of practice, but in places to publish, preprints or other things and work within the community, So really, I just wanted to indicate the ResearchGate and Academia.edu pull sort of a research flavored double duty here, that they meet both the criteria of social media, your academic profile. If you were the kind of person who would make a Twitter account just for tweeting out about your research, you're probably the kind of person who would consider a ResearchGate account. But then you also can be a part of a community of practice. So again, more eyes on your research, keeping up with new developments, limited and intentional, and the drawbacks and context here are always platform dependent. Depending on your trust of ResearchGate or any of these other organizations. But if there was a particularly valuable community of practice in my field on ResearchGate, I would probably be on ResearchGate to be part of that community of practice. So research profiles, this is of course why we're here, the things we want to discuss. And I try to stress generally these platforms are the ones that are the most specific to publishing and tracking scholarship. These platforms are generally less fun. I might also say the phrase sexy, and they're more professional. Folks I've talked to typically really only use one of these. They've made time in their life to sort of maintain one of these things. And I will say off the top, there are a few questions about researcher ID. I haven't really spent a ton of time talking about researcher ID or honestly even really thinking about it. But I think that the general comparison to Scopus is fair. So we'll get into that. So Google Scholar, off the top, ubiquitous, effective. Everybody knows what Google Scholar is. Some people hate Google Scholar. Some people love Google Scholar. We know that Google Scholar is essential in a lot of ways. The way I always frame a conversation around Google Scholar is around the reliability of Google broadly. So in 2021 alone, Google has killed or announced the cancellation of approximately 21 projects. I always make a note of showing researchers the Killed by Google website. If you haven't looked, it's worth a look. They're not always really interesting projects, but it does show you all of the things that they've put time into that they have canceled. Google has given us lots of reasons to suspect that they could cancel Google Scholar more or less whenever they feel like it. This might sound hypocritical from someone who relies heavily on a Gmail account, but the difference is that Gmail makes Google money and Google Scholar really doesn't. For those who don't know, Google Scholar staff is approximately 12 people tops. If you have conversations with Monica Weston, who's currently the sort of community lead, if you ask her about how many people are at Google Scholar, she said the phrase, "You are speaking to the department." So when you think about one person sort of acting as the community lead for something everybody has put this many eggs into, divestment's hugely important here. It's enormous, but if it doesn't make money and it's barely staffed in the first place, and Google took the "don't be evil" chunk out of their general procedures document, their mandate, this could go at any time. There's no evidence necessarily that that will happen, but I will also say it's highly unlikely that it will develop new features or warrant development investment from Google. And we hear this regularly, that there's really not much of an indication that things are going to change in this space. Things are pretty stagnant. So their influence is enormous. And it's, again, only like 12 people, and it's like a handful of developers and a couple other folks, their lead, and then Monica. It could be gone tomorrow. So when I'm discussing this with folks, I usually say, look, it's too useful probably to ignore fully. It's easy enough to use. It's very minimal use. And it has a future too uncertain to rely on it solely. You can get content from Google Scholar into ORCID through like a BibTeX export and then a BibTeX import. It's not great, but you can do it. So if you have stuff in Google Scholar, you can kind of move things, and you're, don't mind hand editing BibTeX, which I guess that's probably a unique kind of person who likes to do that. You can move stuff in between, but otherwise the interaction's not super there. So, your mileage may vary, I suppose. Because Scopus ID, Elsevier owned, can integrate with ORCID. Too big to fail. I do really believe that. Inevitable metadata headaches is part of the conversation. You will not capture everything. Oh, I didn't finish this line. It just says limited to Elsevier's. I don't totally know what I meant by that. But I do kind of hate Elsevier, if that helps. And then don't publishers have enough? So Scopus is enormous, and Elsevier is an unstoppable juggernaut. I have no reason to steer researchers away from having a Scopus ID that isn't ethical or political. If it works for them, it works for them. It's a fine platform. The biggest downside here, I think, is that if a user isn't already using ORCID, they will inevitably have to spend time curating their profile. If you do just a quick look at like Scopus ID, if you write Scopus ID ORCID into Google and you look, it's almost all like libguides on how to curate and tidy up your Scopus ID based on the metadata that's coming into it. At least if you have that stuff in ORCID, you can just dump your stuff in, and you can do that vice versa too. But the nice thing is that your ORCID is included in metadata in a lot of places, and your Scopus ID won't be. So having an ORCID will make the life of a Scopus ID user easier and better broadly. Yeah, I think that's really all I have to say about Scopus. Researcher ID, similarly, Clarivate owned, can integrate with ORCID. I put too big to fail. Pierre said, isn't this not a thing? But Clarivate bought Publons. Publons was big for a minute. Clarivate is the metrics place, so an investment in this space would make sense. Again, inevitable metadata headaches, can't capture everything, and don't publisher / metrics companies have enough. So, a counterpart to Scopus owned by Clarivate, who are really starting to grow in a non-trivial way in this space. Again, I have no real reason to steer people away from using Researcher ID. The biggest downside here, again, is if they aren't already using ORCID, they'll have to spend more time tidying. I genuinely have a hard time distinguishing between these two in any real way. Clarivate purchase Publons is a big deal, and they've rolled that into the offering here. It kind of is the offering, and because they're in the business of selling metrics, they may be more fulsome in this respect. It kind of reminds me of people arguing about like PC or Mac. Like honestly, in the end, it doesn't. Capitalism will destroy us all. It's kind of you do the thing that makes the most sense to you. But I think ultimately what I come down to when I have this conversation with folks, and I think the folks who use Scopus ID already know to use Scopus ID in their communities of practice. They've had the conversation and talked to other people who have it. And I think it's probably similar for Research ID. But typically when I steer people towards ORCID, it's an easier sell for folks in a lot of different ways. So obviously it's not for profit, scholarly open infrastructure. Those are the two sort of big warm fuzzies here. It's great for identity reasons, which is really big, I find. And I know the other two do it, but it's definitely not the Scopus, when you sign up for Scopus ID, nobody ever says this will help you disambiguate your identity. It's like, so you can track your publications in Scopus is the conversation. But in ORCID, I think leading with the identity first issue is a big one. It's leveraged by the other two and also most publishers. This is really the big one. So Crossref, for example, everybody when they publish, they mint a DOI. ORCID and ORCID IDs are part of the Crossref schema. This is not the case with other IDs the same way. So that metadata gets passed all the way through. So you publish in a place, you've got an ORCID account, you've got an ORCID ID, you publish, it shows up in metadata in Crossref, and then that can automatically be added to your publication record. Because the integrations, the pushing back and forth doesn't happen the same way with Scopus or Research ID, ORCID is a better investment of your time up front and can help populate all those other places as you go. So I always steer people in this direction. It's basically an academic CV, which is something people can wrap their head around when I talk about it as a platform. Its API does allow for a number of integrations with other platforms that exist. ORCID is not for profit with open governance and transparency. Again, not a thing we hear from publishers in particular. And primarily for me, the big sell here, again, is identity. Let researchers know that names are messy. And names are, if you're predominantly North American of white heritage without, you've had sort of a cis existence without anything, you're like, yeah, it's first name, middle name, last name, big deal. But those metadata fields don't track that simply across cultures and countries and people and genders and identities. So it's a big deal to stand in front of a room full of researchers and say, look, if you transition, if you get married, if you are an immigrant and adopted an easier version of your name because you didn't want to have people constantly asking you how to pronounce yours, there are lots of reasons why you would want to have a disambiguation feature tied to your publication and for that to be included in the metadata where you publish. That's really important. So, on the flip side of this, the replacement of names of the PID does kind of freak people out a little bit. It's kind of like being barcoded. But I think as long as the scholar is in control, it really isn't too problematic. ORCID is kind of unsexy, but increasingly necessary for researchers. I think the pitch here is a slam dunk. I usually say start in this place and choose your other platforms after that. And again, I added in the notes here that Researcher ID and Scopus ID aren't common metadata in publications with metadata registries, but ORCID is. So all of that open infrastructure wants to talk to each other, right? So ORCID, Crossref, DataCite, ROAR, increasingly, they're all kind of learning how to communicate with each other. And Scopus is happy to pull content in, but much less likely to push content out. Context is really important. I know that researchers use a lot of these platforms in a way that is to them their research profile. I mentioned before the idea of just a simple web page. I definitely have at least a handful of faculty who send me publications and they say, you can get them on my profile page. And it's just a web page they made sometime between 1995 and now, full of all their publications. And they call that their research profile. You can use Twitter with a specific account for your research. Your lab can have a Facebook page. You can put all of your publications with variable legality on ResearchGate. The most important takeaway from this work isn't to limit or discourage these methods of sharing research. It's to contextualize the intent and benefit of the platforms that we call research or scholar profiles. So just a few more notes of ways that I talk about this with folks broadly. Number one, early career researchers. So early career researchers are going to move around. Having a platform that represents their work independent of things like subscriptions, collections, packages, authentication, all of that stuff is going to be handy. Starting with ORCID will demonstrably save them time and frustration, and they are most often the most receptive to identity-based upsides as well. Mid to late career researchers, when I have this conversation, it's usually, sort of a idle curiosity, I guess, that they come to hear me talk about a thing that they've heard in passing. And I guess it really depends on the institution. If there's a CRIS platform at your institution and it's integrating ORCID and you've been asked to use it, your motivation may be very different than at a place that is not leveraging that integration. What is your research office looking for? Is there a mandated ID? My biggest message to anyone in this space is if you're using something that works for you and you're happy, keep using it. So if somebody was happily populating their Scopus ID and they asked me if they needed to use ORCID, I would say, well, you could, and it would be pretty easy to connect the two, but you'll probably spend some time connecting things. If you're happy with Scopus, then that's probably fine for now. Researchers don't really care about these things because of the cool integrations a research office might be into. But I mean, they do care about things like not duplicating effort or saving themselves time. Years of talking about open access have taught me that it's the right thing to do is not a compelling narrative for most people to do anything. They're usually looking for tangible benefits to their career or to their workload or things that will save them time and effort later. So I think it's the most important to think about what the carrot really is. Things they're going to be really interested in. Administrators, well, I'm not great at talking to administrators, and it's kind of my least favorite group of people to talk to about this. Research offices are often looking to save themselves time while funneling data into systems that let them accumulate sort of a bird's eye view of the research at their institution. They want to tell a research story. They want to get a good sense of where their money's going and what's where. And this has always been a problem that they've had. And sometimes they see things like ORCID as a way to solve that problem. I indicate that my own research office asked me to help, quote unquote, exploit ORCID, which is not a thing that makes me want to communicate with them in a real way, but I have to. And some of this, I'm going to flip the script a little and say that a bit of this is kind of ORCID's fault, because ORCID sells memberships and pitches all the great things you get with a membership and all the integrations you get with a membership, but often leaves out the part that integrations only happen if you buy the software platform that integrates with it, or you install the software platform that integrates with it. So at my institution, at least, there's been sort of an impression that ORCID will solve a bunch of problems independently. And because ORCID's API, requires a membership for people to write custom code to pull content to or from, some people are hesitant to do that. I think it's important when having conversations with people to figure out what their investment is going to be in actually pulling this data and using it in a useful way, not just that ORCID will magically solve their problems. It's frustrating that there appears to be significant buy-in in institutions to leverage scholarly open infrastructure. The Crossref API and the ORCID API, I'd say, are probably the two most important open APIs in scholarly publishing, next to the Microsoft Academic Graph, which is on its way out. They want to leverage these things for number crunching, and I get it. There's a lot of numbers. The best I can offer that institutions who support and leverage ORCID can save their researchers time, and I think that's the big one. If there's an emphasis on doing more with less, this ought to be the primary carrot. And I would warn also broadly, and I typically do, against mandating ORCID at institutions. To me, the narrative of scholar-driven and owned and transparency and required for assessment are at cross purposes. Sometimes people think it would be better if we all just got everybody on ORCID, and that would probably be true, but I would rather it be more consensual than mandatory. So how you talk to your administrators is really up to you. This is a pretty unique context, but I thought it was worth discussing. So the bottom line, ORCID is easy to recommend. Other choices are contextual and will really depend on the researcher you're talking to. Telling people they're doing it wrong isn't useful. This is probably the case for most things, but allowing in this conversation the space that somebody's zany Squarespace site is important to them. If it is, they say it is, then it is. And you can let them know that there are other options. It's important to stress researcher agency. I think this is huge, and I feel this way about open access too. We spend a lot of time trying to empower researchers about keeping their copyright and engaging against having serious conversations with publishers and thinking about how they publish and how they share their research. And then we tell them what to do all the time also. It's hugely important for me personally to have researchers understand their choices in this space and that those choices matter and they should make them with intention. How you share your work should not be an oversight. And then lastly, you are doing a great job. I can't substantiate this, but I have no reason to believe it is untrue. So I think with that, I'm done and we can move things to questions.
Thanks so much, Mike. That was a really, I think, helpful and interesting presentation. So I think, Sheila, you're allowing people to unmute themselves now. So we'll ask people to perhaps raise hands and go ahead. But I think I do see one question in the chat, Mike, from Scott. Aren't many funding agencies requiring or beginning to require grant applicants to have ORCID IDs? Isn't this a powerful motivator for many researchers?
Yeah, I mean, there's a part of me that would love it if in Canada, our granting agencies understood what ORCID was or how it could do anything for them. But yeah, I mean, that's a great motivator. And I think it works a lot better than an employer mandate. If you're going to apply for funding, have this so we can get your publications is taking the place of, I think, in some cases, filling out an online form with a list of all of your publications, which is the thing everybody hates doing a second time. When I've talked to researchers that have been in the UK, then they came here. There's one researcher at my institution who came and he said, oh yeah, I've got an ORCID and I've got all this stuff, whatever, it's not a big deal. And it was very easy to talk to him about it because he'd been doing it for forever. And it was not a problem for him because everything was already in that place. So yeah, I do think that funders requiring it makes way more sense than employers demanding it. That's my personal take.
Yes, and I will also just say that for the US, that is also something that we're starting to see more of is funders requiring ORCID IDs or at least asking for ORCID IDs. And next month in November, we're having our community call on that topic of ORCID and funding workflows. So stay tuned for that.
So I see we have another question from Alicia who says, is there a justification or reason for an institution to invest in ORCID, Web of Science, and Scopus in the context of making researcher lives easier?
Well, so I think from the ORCID context, that part's, I think, really an easy ask. And I think this is part of the conversation I've been having regionally. I mentioned that issue with integrations and having to have a platform that takes an integration for your ORCID membership to really be intrinsically useful. But the way I have a conversation with my Dean of Libraries is that actually what we're doing is we're investing in scholarly open infrastructure. So the cost of, your membership to ORCID is the cost of keeping the lights on, so to speak, or keeping the water running. It's an infrastructure cost, and it makes sense. Investing in properly pulling content from Web of Science or Scopus, I think that ask is harder from a research office perspective. On one hand, if you use the Scopus ID and you've got Elsevier Pure, there are probably interactions between the two that would make your life a lot easier. But there are things that those platforms don't talk about, which is, not journals, which is a big part of the assessment package, and how people handle stuff like committee work and all these other things that aren't tracked the way journal publications are tracked. I would argue that probably a Scopus ID isn't going to make a lot of sense to an English professor. There's going to be a lot that doesn't get represented there the same way. And I think journal publishing, again, and science publishing is particularly driven this narrative about what is or isn't useful and who gets to have the conversation. But I would be more hesitant to dip into those things. But if you've had a campus that has invested time into helping people get on ORCID and get their content into ORCID and spend time in this space, and then you decide that you want to go buy one of these other big vendor platforms that has an integration and pulls in stuff from ORCID, then you're kind of doing both things. So I would think ORCID is the better broad get people on board platform. And then, you can suck out of it what you suck out of it with whatever platform you want to use. But that's a crass way to refer to getting information out of ORCID, but here it is. So yeah, I don't know. The question about making people's lives easier is a real swing. Hey, like I'm not sure that that's why research offices do it. That to me, that doesn't always seem obvious.
Mitchell, go ahead.
Sure. Thanks, Mike, for the presentation. On my campus, it's not a sudden thing, but my university librarian, also members of the administration, are very much talking about open science framework as both a vision and a direction to move. And luckily, a lot of what we do in digital scholarship service work fits into that narrative. So ORCID, DOIs, data repositories, software, OERs fit into that. In a sense, I probably am pitching to the administration if we use open science framework as a model. So I guess my question is, since we're selling to different audiences, I usually talk to faculty about the benefits for them personally, and then might explain, there's value downstream. We saw that during COVID. People could find your work when other people's work is not available. But for administrators, they like this idea that now they're creating sort of sustainable framework to open science. Again, we're not trying to get to a mandate, but different support from different levels. Can we see this simultaneous conversation sort of campaign to address concerns both at the big level and the small level?
Oof, I don't know if I'm qualified to answer that question.
This is one of those bigger ones where it's almost into administrative policy. Like we can help you with that, but really what we're doing is working on the like you said, the infrastructure to feed this larger perspective.
Yeah, and I guess for me too, like my personal situation is that my institution is looking into a CRIS system that does not properly leverage ORCID, and they've asked me to provide feedback. And largely what I've said to them in the choosing of the platform they've chosen is, I actually I can't help you do that. The thing you want is not something I can support. Unfortunately, I'm at a place where I am able, in my position and authority, like I'm lucky to have tenure and I'm a faculty member. I can say like, actually, I'm just not gonna no, I really don't want to be a part of that conversation you're going to have. I think it's okay for the library and people in open scholarship to draw firm boundaries between themselves and what administration wants. I know libraries are usually super thirsty for validation, and it's nice to be asked, and it's nice to be acknowledged in that space. But having firm policies on the library side, like this is what we'll support, and this is what we can't support, and we'll do what we can to help you in this space, is completely reasonable. But I think, you're right. Like the administration is going to make their call for the reasons they make it. And those are probably going to be, at least one of those reasons will be related to the things that the marketing department gets to say. And I'm not always interested in helping the marketing department, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Does anyone else have questions or even comments or ways that you have talked to your own researchers about these different options? Feel free to unmute or type in the chat. This is the discussion portion.
Sure, I'll talk again. Mitchell Brown, I'm from University of California, Irvine. So I've had faculty who ask me about what is this thing, ResearchGate or Academia EDU, and why would I want to do it through our own institutional repository? And ours is branded eScholarship. And without getting too scary, I explained that if you use eScholarship, we will help you find the appropriate version. And the university actually assumes the liability for the deposit for that. And if you would then be interested in populating the other resources, you will have a version you can share if you wish more broadly. So we can help you, but it'll also be there permanently because the university is really thinking 150 years down the road, and we're likely to be around. I just don't know if ResearchGate and Academia EDU, I don't know what their long-term plan is. Plus, I don't know who's behind all of it. and I don't know that you can actually talk to them as easily as you can with the university.
Good points.
Sort of a follow-up to that, Mitchell, to Mitchell's point, when we're talking to faculty about ResearchGate and academia, that whole idea of a persistent, appropriate copy, if they want to play in ResearchGate and EDU, we encourage them to use a link rather than putting a copy in ResearchGate and academia. It's a little harder to do because they certainly want your content, but it means that you're giving a link to researchers that will persist on the longer term.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's like really important just to frame them in that like this is Silicon Valley startups. They are venture capital funded. They are about making money. Right now, if ResearchGate starts forming, like my take is that ResearchGate is making a real effort to become legit in the way that Scopus ID is. That like ultimately their dream and the dream of a lot of startups is a multi-million-dollar acquisition. So a big publisher steps in and goes like, you know what, actually, that's ours now. And we've seen that happen a bunch, right, with lots of other platforms. And that's kind of the end goal in a lot of big startups is like a big out. So, Clarivate buys Publons. Clarivate, could just as easily make an offer on ResearchGate. And then they're talking about rolling that infrastructure into another place. So, they're for-profit platforms that are not particularly interested in you individually as a user. I think that's always the key. And whether or not somebody trusts publishers first and foremost is also a pretty unique thing. Some people will go to war for Elsevier. I've talked to faculties who are super loyal to a company that has sold them back their labor for years. So like it's if somebody's really into an Elsevier product, they're into an Elsevier. I'm not going to win that push.
One thing I wanted to add here that I don't think you brought up, Mike, although it's certainly heavily implied by everything you've said, is that when we're talking about research control and proprietary systems, ORCID, you cannot create an ORCID record on someone's behalf, or at least you certainly shouldn't, although you can be delegated with that scholar's permission, the ability to help manage their ORCID record. In contrast, I have no idea if this is still how academia.edu works, but back when my account was first created, I didn't create it for myself. I was asked to claim it. It was something that popped up with a picture of me from Google Scholar scraped off of a slightly embarrassing but fun Movember photo shoot that I did with friends to raise some money for Movember. So it was not how I would have created an academic profile for myself. It was scraped and then suggested that I claim it. I don't think I would have been able to shut it down and say, not only do I not want this, but please get rid of this. I think it's just there, and they're saying, would you like it? Yes or not now. So that kind of almost what I felt at the time as a scholar was predatory approach. It wasn't just the behind the scenes selling your data. It was also the component of it that was predatory.
Well, we've got a few minutes left. Are there any last minute thoughts or questions that anyone would like to share? And this is our closing slide as well for anyone that wants to talk more about these topics, or if you have more specific questions about anything that was covered, you can email us. If you're in Canada or in the US, these are your respective communication channels for getting in touch with us. Looks like we've got a lot of thank yous. So yes, thank you so much, Mike. That was a great presentation. I know I learned a lot. I think I saw some things in the chat that others learned a lot as well. So wonderful. Thanks so much for sharing and being our guest presenter today. And thanks to everyone for attending this. I hope this was helpful. So I guess just stay tuned for the future community calls coming in both the Canadian and the US communities. And we'll look forward to getting together again soon. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great rest of your day. And thanks again, Mike.
No problem.
Right.
Thank you.